After Carroll O'Connor's passing in 2001, his elegant Mediterranean-style estate in Pacific Palisades remained unsold for several years. It was a grand property, sitting atop a bluff with commanding views of the Pacific Ocean, surrounded by high hedges and wrought iron gates. Neighbors often whispered about the house, about the fact that it never seemed to stay occupied for long. Some said it was cursed, others merely unlucky. In 2018, a middle-aged couple, Mark and Lillian Brewer, bought the house for what seemed like a bargain. Mark was a retired entertainment lawyer, and Lillian, a former production designer. They dreamed of restoring the estate to its former glory. The house had character. Exposed beams, arched doorways, dark wood floors, and a stone fireplace nearly as tall as a man. Yet behind its beauty, there was an uneasy stillness, as though the walls had learned to hold their breath. The first sign that something was wrong came within the first week. At night, Lillian would wake, convinced someone was pacing the hallway just outside their bedroom. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, as if a man was lost in thought. Mark insisted it was the old wood settling, but Lillian wasn't convinced. The hallway smelled faintly of cigars some nights, despite no one smoking in the house. The scent would drift in and out, sharp and distinct. When Mark finally smelled it himself, he decided to check the old library, Carroll's favorite room, according to the old real estate listing. The library was cold, always colder than the rest of the house, regardless of the season. Mark noticed something else. The books on the middle shelf, particularly those related to acting and performance, seemed displaced. Each morning, one or two would be slightly pulled from the shelf, like someone had been leafing through them, but carefully putting them back. One evening, during a small dinner party, one of their guests, a director who had once worked with O'Connor on a short-lived TV pilot, refused to step inside the library. He paled at the threshold, muttering, "He's still in there. I can feel him watching." They laughed it off at the time, but when the guest abruptly left without explanation, Lillian couldn't shake the discomfort. Weeks later, Mark was in the living room late at night, reviewing some documents, when he heard the static murmur of a television. The old set in the den, the one they hadn't gotten around to replacing, was on. The screen was tuned to an empty channel, but through the static, a voice could be heard muttering angrily. It wasn't clear, but Mark could swear he heard phrases like, "That's not right, do it again, show some spine." He turned off the set, but when he stepped away, it clicked back on. No remote, no timer. Lillian began seeing the shadow of a man sitting in the leather chair by the fireplace, visible just from the corner of her eye. When she'd turn, there would be no one there, but she described him to Mark. Heavyset, older, dressed in slacks and a loose shirt, legs crossed as though judging a performance. One night, after months of these incidents, they called in a local historian who was familiar with the house. She told them that O'Connor was known to rehearse his lines aloud, walking the halls, sitting in his chair for hours, practicing monologues. She theorized that maybe some fragment of his discipline and frustration lingered. The breaking point came in early spring. Lillian was alone in the house when she heard a man shouting. She followed the voice to the library, where the door slammed shut in her face. On the other side, she heard someone berating an actor, shouting that they were ruining the scene. She swore she heard the name Archie, the character Carroll O'Connor famously played in All in the Family. When Mark returned home that evening, he found her sitting on the front steps, pale and trembling. They sold the house weeks later quietly, without any mention of what had transpired inside. The current owners? No one knows. The property was purchased through a shell corporation, and the house now sits largely unoccupied. The grounds are maintained, but no lights shine from the windows after dusk. Locals still say, if you walk by on a foggy evening, you might hear the muffled sound of a man's voice rehearsing lines inside, punctuated by bursts of laughter that aren't entirely friendly. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Mark Brewer never intended to believe in ghosts. He was a man of contracts, clauses, and cold logic. But logic, he was starting to realize, had no place within the walls of that house. By late April, the ocean mist had begun to roll deeper into Pacific Palisades, and when it did, the house changed. The sea air made the wooden beams sweat and the windows weep condensation, and a dampness settled into the hallways, like the house itself was exhaling. The faint scent of cigars became a permanent undercurrent, curling through the corridors, seeping from the dark paneling of the library. Lillian refused to step into the library now. She said the air was wrong there, thick, heavy, like breathing through wet cloth. She claimed that when she stood in the doorway, the light shifted, as if a shadow too large for the space had just ducked around the corner. She'd feel her pulse in her throat and an irrational anger rising, as if someone was silently judging her presence. Mark began to notice peculiarities beyond the library. The den, where that ancient wood-paneled television sat, had its own disturbances. One night, while he was reviewing old case files on his laptop, the air grew inexplicably cold. The temperature drop wasn't gradual, it was immediate, abrupt, as though someone had opened a freezer door beside him. Then the sound came, a tinny, rattling noise like an old broadcast warming up. He glanced up and saw the television screen flickering to life on its own. The display was black and white, showing nothing but static snow. But through the hiss, a voice began to speak. Low at first, mumbling, almost incoherent. But then clear as day, it barked. What the hell kind of delivery was that? Don't you know your own lines? Mark froze. His mouth went dry. He waited, half expecting the sound to fade like it always did. But instead, it continued, a gruff, commanding voice that paced up and down in a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. Like a director on a set, chastising some invisible actor for getting it wrong, again and again. He forced himself up from the chair, walked to the TV, and pulled the plug from the wall. The screen stayed on for 3 full seconds after the cord was free. The voice? It stopped instantly. That night, Mark didn't tell Lillian. He couldn't find the words. She was already fragile from her own experiences, her sleepless nights, the pacing footsteps, the growing conviction that someone was watching her from doorways she dared not approach. But it was Lillian who broke the silence first. She told Mark that sometimes, when she brushed her hair before bed, she could see in the mirror, not directly, but in the depth of its reflection, a figure seated in the leather chair by the fireplace. Not moving, just sitting, watching her with a heaviness that made her stomach turn. She described him with precision. A large man, slightly stooped, with thick shoulders and thinning hair. Always dressed in light trousers and a dark-collared shirt, the cuffs unbuttoned, as though perpetually in the middle of a rehearsal. "I see him there," she whispered one night as they sat in the kitchen, their wine untouched. "And when I turn around, he's gone. But I know he's still there." Mark wanted to reassure her, to tell her they were imagining things brought on by the house's age, the isolation, the proximity to the whispering sea. But his own skin crawled with doubt, with the things he'd seen and heard. There was more. On certain nights, particularly when the fog was dense and the moon hidden, music would drift faintly from the library. A low, melancholy jazz tune, something from the 60s, maybe earlier. When Mark approached the room, the sound would fade, evaporating into the dense air like breath on a mirror. The first time he heard it, he searched the house for a hidden speaker or radio, but there was nothing. The house was silent, but for that fleeting music that seemed to come from the wood itself. Eventually, they invited a medium on Lillian's insistence. A woman in her late 60s named Margot, with kind eyes but a stern demeanor. She entered the house with her palms outstretched, eyes half closed, as if feeling the air like a blind person feeling a sculpture. She made it as far as the threshold of the library before stopping. "There's a man here," she said quietly. "He doesn't know he's gone. Or maybe he refuses to admit it." Mark asked her to explain, but she only shook her head. She said the house was filled with rehearsals, with expectations, with frustration that never resolved. "He's still trying to finish something," Margot whispered, "but no one's giving him his scene partner." When she left, she refused payment, her hands trembling. She advised them to leave the house sooner rather than later. They didn't, not yet. Part of Mark held on to the idea that it could be solved, understood, controlled. But Lillian had begun to change. She grew thinner, her face pale, with deepening shadows under her eyes. She said that when she tried to sleep, she heard her name spoken not in her ear, but somewhere in the room. A deep, aggravated voice that said, "Lillian, don't just stand there. Say your line." One night, Mark found her standing in the hallway outside their bedroom, whispering something to herself over and over. When he touched her shoulder, she jumped and looked at him with wild, unfamiliar eyes. "He's waiting for me to answer," she said. "If I don't, he gets upset." Mark didn't know who he was, but he didn't have to ask. He knew. And still, the library door sometimes stood ajar in the morning, though neither of them remembered leaving it that way. A cigar stub, crumbling and ancient, appeared once on the mantel. The television flickered on without power. And always the pacing in the hallway. Endless pacing. As if Carroll O'Connor was still there, walking the boards, searching for the perfect line, waiting for his scene partner to get it right. The pacing became worse by June. Not just heavier, but purposeful, like the measured steps of a man trying to memorize a speech. Every night, just after 2 a.m., the sound would begin at the far end of the hallway near the old guest room and travel slowly, heel to toe, to the master bedroom door. And then it would stop. Mark would sit up in bed, holding his breath, staring at the door's shadow beneath the frame. He never dared open it. On one occasion he thought he heard breathing on the other side, slow, labored, an exhale that rattled faintly like lungs that had been exhausted for decades. Lillian stopped sleeping entirely in the bedroom after that. She moved into one of the guest rooms, claiming she felt less watched there, though not entirely safe. The guest room had heavy curtains and a smaller bed pushed into the corner. But more importantly, it didn't sit along the pacing route. Mark was stubborn. He stayed in the master bedroom, telling himself every night that it was just old wood, or his imagination, or some structural oddity he hadn't diagnosed. But deep down, in the raw spaces of his mind where denial couldn't tread, he knew that wasn't true. One night he gathered his nerve and stood by the bedroom door at 2 a.m. waiting for the steps. Right on time, the creaking started. Slowly, each footstep grew louder, heavier, until the unseen walker reached the other side of the door. Mark clenched the doorknob, its brass cold against his palm, slick with sweat. He yanked it open. The hallway was empty, except the scent of cigars. Thick, fresh, almost choking. The carpeted floor was warm beneath his bare feet, as though someone large had just passed that way, the fibers still compressed in a faint line leading back toward the library. And then, clear as though someone stood inches from his ear, Mark heard. "Again. Let's do it again from the top." He spun around. No one was there. But the voice, it was familiar now. It had weight, authority, frustration. Mark had heard that cadence before in clips of All in the Family, in interviews. The biting, sarcastic rhythm of Carroll O'Connor. By morning, Mark barely remembered returning to bed. His dreams, though, were not his own. They were filled with harsh stage lights, a circle of empty chairs, and a script clenched in his fists that he couldn't read no matter how hard he tried. Lillian's deterioration was accelerating. She became pale and withdrawn. Her eyes ringed with gray as if she'd aged years in a matter of weeks. She confessed one morning that she'd begun to answer the voice when it called for her at night, speaking nonsense, just to appease the angry tone that whispered from dark corners. She wasn't pretending anymore. She was rehearsing. Once, Mark awoke before dawn to find her standing in the living room, barefoot, muttering a scene from a play neither of them knew. She stared past him, as if seeing a partner in the darkness. "Do it again, from the laugh line," she whispered to the air, her voice flat and thin. "He needs it funnier this time." That same day, Mark discovered something in the library that paralyzed him with dread. While moving a stack of old books, he found, tucked behind the shelves, a faded script, its cover worn and corners bent. It wasn't a published piece but seemed to be a handwritten draft, the pages yellowed and spotted with age. The title page read, "Archie's Last Act by C.O." It was unfinished, lines scratched out, angry notes in the margins, and one line circled several times in heavy pencil. "No scene ends without an audience." Mark stared at that for a long time, the house silent around him, save for the distant, barely perceptible sound of footsteps above the attic, perhaps. A place they had not dared explore since moving in. He tried to show it to Lillian, but she recoiled, insisting she didn't want to see it. She claimed she'd already memorized enough, even if she didn't understand how. She said the words were in her head when she slept, as if whispered directly into her ear. Read your part. Read it properly. The nights grew longer after that. Not by the clock, but by the way time stretched within the house. A strange dislocation where minutes felt like hours and hours days. Some evenings, Mark would swear the house felt fuller. Not empty like a crowd had gathered just beyond the periphery of the light. Shadows seemed thicker, layered, as if forms were half-stepping out but never fully revealing themselves. Lillian was speaking less to Mark and more to the empty spaces now. She'd sit by the fireplace, hands folded on her lap, murmuring rehearsals with eyes fixed on the leather chair. Mark caught her once, smiling faintly at it. A tired, devoted smile like that of an actor pleasing a difficult director. And still the footsteps came. Every night, the pacing, stopping at the bedroom door, waiting for Mark to open it, to come out, to take his mark on the stage that stretched down the hall, into the library. Beneath the rafters where something unseen whispered the lines over and over, waiting for perfection that would never come. They had not left yet, but the house was learning them, shaping them. Soon Mark knew he would speak back. He would have to, or Carroll would come upstairs himself. The attic had always been an afterthought. Neither Mark nor Lillian had any use for it, and besides, the narrow staircase that led up behind the kitchen was too steep and close for comfort. It was the kind of place people forgot about, deliberately. Yet as the nights worsened the pacing, the cigar smoke, the voice rehearsing lines that belonged to no known script, Mark found himself waking at dawn, certain that the sound no longer stopped at the bedroom door. It moved up the staircase. He heard the boards groaning above, as if someone had taken residence directly over their heads. Lillian had become almost entirely detached by then. She no longer joined him for breakfast or lunch or dinner. She remained in the guest room or sat by the fireplace, eyes glassy, mumbling half-lines like, "We can take it again from the laugh, yes, funnier, lighter. I'll hit the beat this time." One morning, Mark resolved to go up to the attic. He waited until sunlight pierced the kitchen windows, hoping that the intrusion of day would shield him. The ladder leading up was old, wooden, stained with decades of dust and neglect. It creaked under his weight, and the higher he climbed, the thicker the air became, almost gummy, like moisture suspended with smoke. He pushed the trapdoor open. At first, the attic was nothing but dust motes dancing in shafts of light filtering through a small, grimy window. Boxes of forgotten junk, furniture draped in yellowing sheets, cracked suitcases. But as his eyes adjusted, Mark saw something more. At the far end, beneath the low slant of the roof, was a wooden chair not unlike the leather one by the fireplace, but simpler, worn, its backrest polished from use. Next to it, an old portable reel-to-reel recorder sat on a crate. And behind it, hanging on the wall, were photographs. Rows of black and white headshots like those actors submit to casting calls. Dozens of them, their corners curling, pinned or taped to the wood. Men and women, some smiling, some stern. Most unfamiliar, but a few Mark felt he recognized. Character actors from another era, faces he'd seen fleetingly on old TV reruns. And every single photograph had one thing in common: a large X drawn across it in dark pencil. Except for one space on the wall empty, save for two rusty tacks waiting. Beneath the chair, on the floor, sat a thick binder. Mark's hands shook as he picked it up. The pages inside were filled with scenes, dialogue back and forth, arguments, laughter, emotional confrontations. Some were written, some typed, others scratched out. But all of them ended the same way. Character A. Pausing. "That's not right. We'll have to do it again." And then, no scene ends without an audience. Mark snapped the binder shut, his heart hammering, when he noticed the faintest sound from the recorder. A reel spinning lazily, as though still playing something long since recorded. He reached for it, when a shadow moved behind him. A figure, large and hunched, stepped between him and the light. Mark froze. The scent of stale cigars was overwhelming. The air thickened. The floor beneath him felt soft, as if the house itself had become something organic, something alive and breathing. Then the voice, directly behind his ear, low and brimming with tired rage. "It's your turn, kid. Let's hear it. Don't make me ask twice." Mark bolted, nearly tumbling down the attic ladder, scraping his elbow against the frame. He hit the floor, dizzy and breathless, his ears still filled with the ghost of that voice. But when he looked up, the attic door was still open, and footsteps, heavy, slow, descending after him. He grabbed Lillian from the living room. She resisted, muttering about needing to finish the scene, her eyes unfocused, her lips trembling with half-spoken lines. He shook her, pleaded with her, and finally, she blinked, saw him, and began to weep, clutching his arm. They ran. Out the front door, into the thick morning fog that hung low over the cliffs. They didn't look back. They couldn't. When they finally stopped blocks away, barefoot, their breath clouding the cold air, Mark turned back toward the house. The uppermost attic window, the one facing the street, had a figure in it, sitting, watching, like a director waiting for his cast to return to their marks. The house was sold again quietly through a holding company. As always, no disclosure of the past events was made. But to this day, locals say the house is never truly dark. There is always a faint glow from the attic window, as though a projector is playing for an empty audience. Some say if you stand at the gates long enough, you'll hear the pacing. And if you listen harder, through the sea mist and the wind, you'll hear the voice. No scene ends without an audience. Now take your place. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.